Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Denise Thomas, and I am the founder and owner of the Effective Communication Coach. I am absolutely excited, honored, and thrilled to welcome each of you to the Milwaukee Public Museum's Milwaukee Fight for Social Change interview series. It is happening in conjunction with the extraordinarily special exhibit Mandela, the official exhibition offered in partnership with the America's Black Holocaust Museum. Our interview today will look back at Milwaukee's rich history of the Black liberatory struggle. And to help us do that, we are joined by the Mr. Reggie Jackson, one of the most incredible minds, historians, and experts that I personally know and admire. Now, Mr. Reggie Jackson is a co-founder and lead trainer, consultant for Nurturing Diversity Partners, which is a consulting firm that fosters diversity, inclusion, and equity within institutions and communities. They educate about the history, social cultural dynamics, personal skills, and institutional practices that build a more equitable society. Reggie has and is a much sought after speaker, researcher, and writer for over a decade, both regionally and nationally. His work helps institutions and individuals understand how our country's racial diversity hierarchy developed historically, its impact on our lives today, and how we can realize America's promise for all citizens. Reggie shares seldom told stories and facts about the experiences of African Americans and other peoples of colors, past and present. He writes and provides background on current racial issues to both regional, national, and international media. Needless to say, we are fortunate to have Mr. Reggie Jackson with us. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Reggie Jackson. Good morning, Reggie.
Good morning, Denise. Great to be here with you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm excited to be part of this program with Milwaukee Public Museum and America's Black Holocaust Museum.
Thank you for that, Reggie. And again, we are so excited to have you here on behalf of the Milwaukee Public Museum and America's Black Holocaust Museum. So let's get started, because I know we have an hour, which seems as though that's a sufficient amount of time, but based on all of your knowledge, all of your expertise, this time is going to fly. So I hope that everyone is going to prepare some great questions as we tap into the extraordinary mind of Mr. Jackson. So Reggie, if you could share with us your pathway to where you are today, the work that you've done, the work that you're doing to the community. How'd you get here?
Well, Denise, my path in this particular work started in 2002 when I went that summer and volunteered at America's Black Holocaust Museum. Became one of the griots at the museum, and these are the docents that would give you tours. We use the word griot, that's a French-speaking word, a French language word that describes the oral historians, the keepers of the history in West Africa, the people that are really an important part of those communities. And so that's the role I played with the museum for nearly 20 years as a griot with the museum, and learning under the tutelage of the founder, Dr. James Cameron, who survived a lynching at the age of 16, opened the museum at the age of 74, and he became a great friend of mine, my mentor, and really started me on this journey and allowed me to kind of get into some spaces traveling around the country on behalf of the museum. And then that developed over a long period of time into not only doing the work on behalf of the museum, but starting my own company with my friend, Dr. Fran Kaplan, Nurturing Diversity Partners. And we've traveled around the state of Wisconsin. We've done work in over 50 communities in the state of Wisconsin. We've done work in over 20 different states around the country. I also write. I'm the senior columnist for the Milwaukee Independent and online magazine. And I've been very fortunate that I have that platform to kind of write about the intersection of race, and a variety of other topics. So, I feel very fortunate that I have these different platforms and the ability to kind of really express how I feel and really express the views of many people that don't have a voice. And I always say that I dedicate this work to my ancestors. I am speaking on behalf of their efforts and their trials and tribulations and resiliency. It's my way of honoring them. And so it's really important to me. I always tell people this work is very personal for me.
Wow, that's incredible. And thank you so much for sharing that, Reggie. And as you have done the work, the necessary work, I know many of the viewers and listeners are wanting to know, in addition to how you became who you are, the why. So, as the Milwaukee Public Museum, again, is partnering with the America's Black Holocaust Museum to host this incredibly necessary interview series, Milwaukee's Fight for Social Change. Let's take a step back and talk about, from your lens, from your experience, when did the struggle, when did the fight for racial justice in Milwaukee first begin?
Well, it started very early in the history of Milwaukee. In fact, in 1835, there was a Black man by the name of Joe Oliver who voted in the first election here in Wisconsin. It was part of the Michigan territory, but there was an election here, and he was allowed to vote. And it would be 31 years before another Black man would be allowed to vote. Despite the fact that 14 years after he voted, there was a referendum on the ballot that Wisconsinites voted and said yes, overwhelmingly said yes, Black men should have the right to vote in this state. But the Wisconsin Elections Commission basically said, no, we're not going to allow you to vote. And so up until 1866, when Ezekiel Gillespie decided to challenge that ruling, it went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they ruled that, yes, absolutely, Black men have the right to vote, and they should have had the right to vote from the time that Joe Oliver voted. And that referendum on the ballot, which said, yes, they should have the right to vote. So the struggle started very early on, and it continued, during the years that the Milwaukee's Black population was very small, but it continued to be a struggle against things like housing discrimination, employment discrimination, discrimination in schools, a variety of different things. And then it accelerated as the Black population grew very rapidly from the World War II period, when Blacks started to come to Milwaukee in larger numbers because of the need for labor during World War II. So the Black population increased from about 9,000 people in 1940 to over 62,000 people by 1960, and then over 105,000 by 1970. So that rapid increase meant that Blacks were in the city and they were looking at some of the challenges. And I always tell people that I moved to Milwaukee in 1973 from Mississippi, little town in Mississippi that was a segregated hospital that I was born into. So I literally started my life dealing with Jim Crow segregation in the South. But before I left Mississippi in second grade, came to Milwaukee in third grade. In second grade, I had white classmates. Moved to Milwaukee from third through eighth grade, I didn't have a single white classmate. So I literally left Jim Crow to South and came to Jim Crow to North without recognizing and understood over the course of time that Black people fought for open housing. They fought for desegregated schools. They fought for employment, fairness in employment, a variety of different things, because they wanted to live their lives the same way the whites in Milwaukee lived. And they were not about to just sit back and accept that they were treated unfairly. They always fought against it. There's always been this resiliency in our community. There's always been this fight. And we see that continuing, to this day.
See, this is why these conversations are so incredibly necessary, and so they break through a lot of the myths that our perception. When I say our, I just mean general population of Milwaukee. One of the myths is that back during the Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow culture, that Blacks migrated from the South to the North to live the good life, to live the freedom life. But based on what you've just shared, that was not the case. Can you elaborate or share with us other myths as it relates to the civil rights movement and the fight for social justice that you've experienced or that you've learned about based on your research?
Yeah, absolutely, Denise. I'll start with this, the myth of the Great Migration and Blacks leaving the South to get away from Jim Crow. Well, first of all, most people don't even know what Jim Crow is. So the name Jim Crow is the name given to a series of laws that literally created a different way of seeing the world for Black people versus white people after slavery ended. States in the South created laws known as Black codes that criminalized the behavior of Blacks and allowed whites to do the same things and not, be arrested for. You also began to see segregation laws created, which basically said, you have to have separate facilities, schools, restaurants, whatever, all of these different things. But also another big part of it was disenfranchisement of Blacks. Black men had gotten the right to vote as a result of, the federal government passing one of the amendments after the Civil War ended. But, less than 40 years later, most Black men were disenfranchised around the country. And so that's kind of this myth that, we were just leaving because of those things. No, we were also leaving because of anti-Black violence in the form of lynchings. 5,000 documented lynchings throughout the country, not just in the South, all over the country. 3 of the most famous lynching photographs of all time were actually northern lynchings. The most famous is the lynching that my mentor, Dr. James Cameron, survived in Marion, Indiana, north central Indiana, August 7th, 1930. That photograph of his 2 friends, Abe and Tommy, who died in that lynching. He survived miraculously. That lynching image led to a young man by the name of Abe Mirapole writing a poem, which eventually became a song called Strange Fruit that he wrote and Billie Holiday made famous. So people have seen that image, they've heard that song, but they don't make the connection between those things and Dr. James Cameron, who founded America's Black Holocaust Museum. And so they were fleeing those those lynchings, but they're also fleeing, massive anti-Black race riots around the country. Atlanta in 1906, Springfield, Illinois in 1908, East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, 25 different anti-Black race riots around the country in the year 1919, known as Red Summer because of all the blood that was shed in that year. Rosewood, Florida in 1923. So all of these anti-Black race riots, the lynchings, the degradation of Jim Crow, that's what led Black people to leave the South and go to find other places to live. They weren't just leaving to find new jobs, better jobs. They were trying to survive. They literally were trying to live a life. And so when they got to Los Angeles, or they got to Seattle or Milwaukee or Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago, New York, Newark, all these different places, they were not welcome in those places. They were treated in a way that was very similar to the way that they were treated in the South. And so what happens is when we think of segregation, residential segregation, we don't realize, most Americans don't realize that most of the residential segregation that's really high is actually in the North, particularly in the Midwest. Milwaukee is considered the most segregated metropolitan area in the country, but you also have Detroit on that list. You have Chicago on that list. You have these places in the North. So people ask me, well, why is segregation worse in the North than in the South? It's because white people didn't want Black neighbors. So they had the power to make neighborhoods that were all white. So they used the power of racial restrictive covenants, which were attached to the deeds of property when you created a subdivision that said only white people can live in this community. They had the federal government, state government, and local governments putting policies and practices in place that refused to give Black people access to loans to become homeowners, to become business owners. And so you created a whole gigantic wall between whites and Blacks that limited their opportunities. The unions didn't accept Blacks in the unions when they came to these cities as well. So there were all of these obstacles, and they literally realized very early on that they were stuck in what were known as ghettos. They left these ugly places in the South, and the white community literally created ghettos. The Kerner Commission report talked about how the white community created the ghettos and maintained the ghettos and supported the ghettos. So Blacks really were leaving one place thinking they were going to go to land where the streets were paved with gold. And they realized it was the exact opposite, that racism in the North was just as strong as it was in the South. But folks in the North like to always point the finger at those bad people in Alabama and Mississippi. Look how horrible they were. But the reality is racism was an American institution, not just a Southern institution. And Blacks realize that. So that's one of the myths, I think, is why we left the South. Another big myth is the civil rights movement and all of the milestones that we celebrate. I tell people all the time, stop celebrating the milestones because you don't know the backstory to the milestone. You don't understand what happened, on August 27th, or was it 28th, 1963, the March on Washington. You don't understand the backstory that led to that March on Washington. It wasn't a March on Washington, it was a March on Washington for freedom and for jobs, right? So that started way back in the 50s. There was this idea, actually even earlier than that, 1940s, there was an idea of marching on Washington, shutting down the federal government to protest the fact that Blacks couldn't get jobs, particularly with the federal government and other agencies. And so eventually it led to that march. And most people are unaware that Dr. King's I Have a Dream, that famous speech he gave, that wasn't his speech that he prepared for that day. He actually prepared a speech that basically talked about what he called a check that America had written to Black Americans, and it came back marked insufficient funds. If you listen to the full version of the I Have a Dream speech, and forget the I Have a Dream part, because that was an add-on. Mahalia Jackson said, Martin, tell them about your dream. But if you listen to the rest of the speech that came before that, you really understand what his message was that day. Had he not said the dream part, nobody would remember his speech, because it was a very open, honest attempt to show that America had been unfair to Black people for the last 100 years. And so we look back and we celebrate things, we don't understand what we're celebrating. I don't celebrate the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because I asked this question: why did we need a Voting Rights Act when we had been given the right to vote in the 1870s? Why did we need a Voting Rights Act to give us that power? Why do we need to have a civil rights movement? Well, we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Law of 1875, all of these laws. We constantly harp on these laws and we celebrate the anniversary of these laws being passed without understanding that passing a law does not mean that people are going to act right. You can't legislate morality. And I think that's part of what we miss out on. We miss out on the backstory of the struggles to get to where we were in terms of Dr. King and all of those other organizations, CORE, SNCC, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, all of these different groups that were fighting tirelessly for years and years and years and years. The Brown versus Board of Education decision, it wasn't like they just came out of nowhere. They've been fighting for decades to get to that point. So we have to understand the backstory. And that to me is one of the myths of how things are accomplished. We look at the date that a law is passed as if nothing happened before that. It just magically came out of nowhere without understanding the struggles were long, hard, and really, we have to understand that those struggles never really end, because we can look at the Voting Rights Act today and see that the most powerful portion of it has been nullified by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that law is basically useless right now for the most part.
And we're going to talk about legislation. And so here's what I want to do really quick, Reggie, for those that may just be tuning in. First of all, get your notepad and your writing utensil, because Reggie is dropping nuggets. Let me just paraphrase in terms of what we've already covered in the first 13 minutes. The myths. Reggie has talked about the myths of voting, the myths related to voting in this country, civil rights movement, the migration from the South to the North. And what Reggie is sharing, and I just want to reiterate the importance of re-educating ourselves, emphasis on the word re-educating. I'm going to put my glasses on, Reggie, because I hear better when I've got my glasses on, and you are dropping some valuable nuggets. Also, one thing I want to highlight before we continue our conversation, you made a powerful statement, which is what I often refer to as a hashtag. You can't legislate on morality. I just want to underscore what you said, because that, my brother, was a powerful statement. You cannot legislate on morality. And I think each of us as viewers and listeners of this interview, that's an aha. That's an aha moment. That's something that is going to provoke a lot of thoughts and understanding the backstory. And as we are part of this incredible interview series hosted by the Milwaukee Public Museum in partnership with the America's Black Holocaust Museum, everything that we are going to gain throughout this interview series, we must, as Mr. Jackson has recommended understand the backstory. We can't just take our history from face value. So what I'd like to do, Reggie, and again, you are dropping some nuggets. I want to go back to what you had referenced and hone in more, because as you mentioned, there's so many cities comparable in both size and makeup as Milwaukee that are fighting still. Can you take us back to when Milwaukee's Black community first went about organizing and fighting for power and change in Milwaukee?
Well, you know, that's been a part of our struggle consistently. But as the Black population started to increase, particularly in the late 50s, early 60s, we started to see more organized, work in terms of groups of people coming together. Alderwoman Vale Phillips being elected in 1956 was huge. You know, we started to see Black parents complain about the Milwaukee public schools, because what was happening as the Black population was increasing very rapidly, the Milwaukee Board of School Directors built new schools, but they built them on the south side instead of the north side. So they literally built schools where they weren't needed. And what ends up happening, the schools on the north side became overcrowded, and they literally had a policy called intact busing. I tell everybody to Google Milwaukee Public Schools intact busing, because literally what they did is they bused Black children to South Side schools, but they kept them separate from their white peers. They had no classes together. They didn't have recess together, lunch together. In fact, many of them were oftentimes put on the bus to go back to their neighborhood school to eat lunch, and then brought back to their South Side school. And so some of those schools even put a trailer in the parking lot, which is where the Black students were taught. And they had to bring their Black teachers with them. They weren't allowed, Black teachers in the 60s weren't allowed to teach white students. So that was one of the things that Blacks in Milwaukee were fighting against. They said, we need new schools. And instead of building new schools, they built them in the wrong part of town. And then the north side schools, what they did is they will build an extension onto that school. Well, it wasn't enough. So in 1964, you started to see freedom schools open up in Milwaukee. You saw boycotts of the schools in Milwaukee, and you saw thousands and thousands of Black children refused to go to school, and they went to these freedom schools, much like the freedom schools in Mississippi and other places. So that was one of those times where the young people in particular came together with the adults and said, listen, we want to have a voice in this. You also saw Alderwoman Vale Phillips beginning in 1962 push for this open housing ordinance in the city of Milwaukee with some teeth in it that would punish people who were discriminating in housing. And she was outvoted 18-1 every time she did it, but that didn't mean she stopped. She kept pushing it every year, until finally 1968, after 200 days of marching across 6th Street Viaduct, we were finally able to get the city to pass that ordinance. But in addition to that, Lloyd Barbie, an attorney here in Milwaukee, said, listen, we're going to force Milwaukee Public Schools to integrate, because they are segregated, even though it's not by law that they're segregated. In the reality, they are. So he filed a lawsuit in 1965 that took all the way to 1976 to be completed. Federal Judge Reynolds ruled that, yes, Milwaukee schools are illegally segregated. You need to come up with a plan to fix it. So that struggle, that's an 11-year struggle just to get the schools to do what they should have been doing all along. And then that journey from 1962 until 1968, a 6-year journey for Alderwoman Vale Phillips to finally convince the Milwaukee Common Council to pass this open housing ordinance. And it was literally, after Dr. King's assassination, when the federal government passed the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, April 11th, literally a week after Dr. King was assassinated, because there was pressure. And Milwaukee played a really important part in that pressure on the federal government. Those 200 days of marching across the 60th Street Viaduct was national news. In fact, it was international news. And that put pressure on the federal government to have those conversations about, this Federal Fair Housing Act, which was a part of 1968 Civil Rights Act. So Milwaukee played a really critically important role in the civil rights movement nationwide. And what's important for us here locally to understand is that we don't teach that in school. right? We don't teach local history. We teach national history. We even teach some state history. We don't teach local history. So people here don't understand what happened in Milwaukee and how Milwaukeeans in the Black community, in the Latino community who joined with the Black community, to fight against some of the same issues, employment discrimination, things of that nature. They work collaboratively, which is another part that's kind of left out of our history, that collaboration and the fact that there were a small number of whites who joined in, but not many. And it's incredibly important to understand that Black people have resiliency. Black people never stop fighting for what's right. And I've always believed this very firmly, Denise, that when you look at the rights that Americans talk about that they're so proud of, many of these rights came about as a result of Black people pushing America to live up to the ideals of the founding fathers. And that's why we have many of the rights that we have. And we take it for granted that, oh, well, America just gave this to us. No, they didn't. People fought for these rights, and Black people were at the forefront of trying to push America in the right direction. And had we not been here, I think America would be quite different in terms of the rights that we would have as citizens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you bring up a great point, and I want to drill into that a little bit more in terms of how and when the Black community really started organizing power and change. And thank you for sharing that. I want to dive into that a little bit more. So as the Milwaukee Black community was fighting and organizing for social justice and change, how was the reception from other community members outside of the Black community regarding the tactics that were used? And before you answer, Reggie, I want to again encourage our distinguished viewers and listeners to start to think about the questions. Any questions you have for Mr. Jackson, please send those questions. We want to make sure that your voices are heard as well and your questions are responded to. So throughout this conversation, please, again, feel free to send any questions that you have. So again, Mr. Jackson, what was the community outside of the Black race in Milwaukee's reception to the movements, to the organization, and to the fight for change?
Well, I think it was twofold. Number one, you started to see people from the Latino community, particularly the Mexican-American community, reach out to the Black community and say, we want to work collaboratively with you. One of the pioneers of that is a good friend of mine, Jesus Salas, who was this just wonderful figure in the history of Latinos in Milwaukee. Most people should know his story, should know the power that Jesus had as a community organizer, an advocate for justice. He reached out to Black community leaders and said, listen, we have more power if we work together. But on the other side of the coin was people in the white community. Very few of them joined that movement. There were some, but not very many. A majority of whites in Milwaukee were against, these efforts to change Milwaukee. They wanted to maintain the status quo. And so, for instance, when you look at the 1967 through 1968, 200 days of marching for open housing, Blacks and the Latinos and whites who were marching with them said, listen, Black people can't live on the south side of Milwaukee. Black people can't live north of Capitol Drive for the most part. They can't live west of, say, 35th Street. We want to open up all of Milwaukee and give people choices to live wherever they want to live. So those 200 days of marching, which started, in August of 1967, culminated in a march to the end of that bridge, where they were met by a mob of at least 5,000 angry whites throwing bricks, bottles, rocks, bags of human feces, bags of urine, just a very angry crowd of people that were there. But that didn't deter those marches, those 250 or so marches that first day. They came back the next day and that crowd had grown exponentially. It was much larger. Police estimates, I've read instances where they said that the crowd was perhaps as large as 13,000 angry whites that second day. And racial epithets were flying. Go back to Africa was flying out of the mouths of these white individuals. They did not want to have Black neighbors. And guess what? It made sense because these are the same people that had put racial restrictive covenants in place. These were the same people that had supported redlining policies and practices by the federal government, by banks, by realtors to keep Black people out of so-called white neighborhoods. In fact, they referred to the 16th Street Viaduct as the longest bridge in the world. They said it separated Africa from Poland because that neighborhood just to the south of the 16th Street Viaduct was a Polish neighborhood. So people fought through that. They fought through the danger danger of that. And there were very few policemen there to protect them. I mean, you can't imagine how difficult it was for these people and how brave they were. This is one of the things I think people really miss, is that it took a great deal of bravery to march into a crowd of thousands and thousands of angry white people who could do harm to you. And there's nothing the police could really do to stop them because they were outnumbered, but they kept fighting and kept fighting and kept fighting. But ultimately, it didn't really work the way we've been told it worked. Another myth is that the open housing campaign in Milwaukee, 200 Days of Marching, opened up the South Side. Denise, it did not open up the South Side. In fact, the special census done in 1975 showed that most of those neighborhoods on the South Side still had single-digit numbers of Blacks in them 7, 8 years after the marches took place, right? And what I tell people, and many of the people that were part of the open housing campaign that I know personally, Peg Rosga, Father Grappi's former wife, Prentice McKinney, many of these people, I tell them, you should be honest with people and tell them that, listen, it didn't open up the South Side, and I opened up the North Side and the West Side, but it didn't open up the hearts and minds of people on the South Side. Black people didn't start moving into those neighborhoods until Latinos moved into those neighborhoods, as whites left and went to other places. Then those neighborhoods became more integrated. But there are a lot of things that we have to understand about the struggles, and what we can learn from the struggles is that, first of all, they're exceptionally difficult. You're trying to change a society that has racism built into it, that it's a part of the consciousness of America. I always say racism is as American as apple pie, because it's embedded in all of our institutions. It's embedded in the structure of our nation, and you can't just make it go away. Ultimately, you have to continue to fight and fight and fight. And that shows the resilience that our community has, always has had, always will have. We're still fighting for those rights to this day, Denise, because we know what being treated the right way is versus the way we've been treated for so long.
Yes. And throughout, Reggie, this extraordinary knowledge sharing that you're providing us, you've referenced legislation multiple times. And I know that we want to touch base on legislation, and I'm going to combine this with how you've elaborated on myths. What is the biggest myth within the Black community as it relates to legislation and voting in this country from your lens?
Well, I think there's a myth that once you pass a law, everything changes. As I said earlier, you can't legislate morality. You can pass all of the laws you want to pass, but if you don't have people buying into those laws, if you don't have people that say, okay, this is the right thing to do, we're going to do the right thing moving forward, those laws don't really mean anything. So let's take a look at a few laws that we celebrate, right? We celebrate the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and part of that act said that certain states and communities that had been discriminating against Black people in voting are going to be forced to submit any changes to voting laws to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice, the federal government, will have to okay any of those changes, right? And so that was put in place because there was no other way you could get these mostly Southern communities to give Black people a right to vote, because they had been given a right to vote after the Civil War, and then it had been taken away. And so they wanted to maintain that. So unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled not all that long ago that part of the Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary, because they said, oh, those states in the South aren't discriminating against Black people anymore. They're not preventing Black people from voting anymore. They don't have poll taxes and stuff like that anymore. They're perfectly okay now. And literally the day after that Supreme Court decision, Texas became the first state to say, okay, let's put a new voting restriction in place. And we've seen that grow exponentially, particularly since the election last year in November. We've seen state after state after state pass restrictive voting laws. So I always say that, we depend on laws, but listen, new laws replace old laws all the time. And it's not about the laws, it's about the lawmakers. That's what we should concentrate our efforts on, not the laws that they write, but who these lawmakers are. Because if you're looking and you're paying close attention right now, you're seeing more voting restrictions being put in place now than you had back in 1950 and 1960. And people are just willy-nilly passing these restrictions, claiming that, there was some malfeasance in the election in 2020, which is complete nonsense. Anybody with half a brain knows that there was a fair election, but because people weren't pleased with the outcome, they're claiming that, oh no, we have to restrict, all of these different things that happen. And what I always say to people is, listen, it's not about the laws, it's about the lawmakers. You have to focus your efforts on who you elect and pay attention to what they do once you elect them. Don't put that little sticker on your shirt and say, I voted, and think that you finished your job. Follow those people that you voted for. Call them, text them, email them. Do like the older people in our community do. Grab a sheet of paper, write a letter, put a stamp on an envelope and mail it to them, right? Make sure that you're in communication with them. Make sure that you keep track of what they do, because when they send out their campaign literature, they tell you what they plan to do once they're elected, right? How many people go back and say, oh, well, let me pick up this, this junk mail that I got over a period of months from all of these candidates that I voted for. How many people pick those up 3 months, 6 months after the election and say, oh, well, he or she said they were going to do A, B, and C. But I've been paying attention. It seems like they're doing X, Y, and Z instead, Denise. Let me call and ask the alderman. Let me call and ask the mayor. Let me call and ask the governor. Let me call and ask whoever these people are. Why aren't you doing what you campaigned on? Because that is ultimately how politics is supposed to work. That is when we as a nation, we forget that these are our elected officials. They're supposed to represent us, their constituents. They're not supposed to represent themselves. They're supposed to do what's in our best interest based on what we told them we want to see. But because we don't know that as Americans, we don't act on that. They just do whatever they want to do for the most part. And then 4 years later, they're giving out more campaign literature, making more promises that we're not paying attention to whether or not they're keeping those promises. So let's not get caught up in laws and celebrate laws, the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act, which has never been fully enforced, and all these different laws. Forget those laws, forget those milestones. Pay attention to what's happening in the world around you, because we're seeing very quickly how those things that people fought for and died for in the 1960s are being reversed right as we speak today, Denise. That's what we need to focus on.
Right now, states like Florida, Alabama, Georgia, to your point. And here's what I just want to underscore that you shared with us. It's not just voting. Voting is definitely necessary. However, once we vote, we must hold our elected officials accountable by, to your point, once we receive the letter, thanking voters for making the time to go and vote. This is what I'm going to do. We need to read that. We need to understand what we hold our elected officials accountable to do. And when that is not being done, we use our voice, we speak up, and then we know how to or how not to vote for in subsequent elections. I think that's very powerful, because again, the narrative has been go vote. When it's go vote and then hold your elected officials accountable, not just at the national level, but also at the local and state level. So that's very powerful. I appreciate you sharing that, Reggie. Now, speaking of the work and the fight, which is why we are here today. From your lens, from your experience, what distinguishes Milwaukee's civil rights fight, Milwaukee's civil rights struggle from other civil rights struggling happening elsewhere in the United States? Because to your point, there's so many myths, there's so many associated feelings and misperceptions when we think of Milwaukee's civil rights. So again, what distinguishes our civil rights struggle from other cities? Because again, as you mentioned, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, well, I think in many ways, Milwaukee is a microcosm of the United States in terms of some of the injustices faced by marginalized groups, whether it be based on race and ethnicity, gender, whatever. And so one of the things I think that's very unique about Milwaukee that people don't know, because we don't teach local history, is that Milwaukee was a place that was in the national spotlight because of the efforts to end segregated schooling, which you typically think of segregated schooling as a Southern thing, right? You think of employment discrimination and not being able to get a job at places like Woolworth. You think of those as things that happen in Mississippi and Alabama and Florida and Georgia. When you think of open housing, segregated housing, you think of the South. But Milwaukee was, in the middle of all of that. There's a wonderful book written about the civil rights movement in Milwaukee called Selma of the North. And that's literally what Milwaukee was.
Hold on, pause. You just dropped the nugget. Say the book one more time, because I know folks are going to want to write this down.
It's called Selma of the North by Patrick Jones. It's a phenomenal look at the history of the civil rights movement in Milwaukee. And in many respects, when you think of Selma, a certain images come to your mind, right? But you don't have those same images when you think about Milwaukee. But Milwaukee was on the forefront of a lot of the things that you were seeing in other places. And I think Milwaukee was a shining example of what happens when a group of people come together and they say, listen, we want change to happen. That's going to be positive change. And we're going to fight tooth and nail to make those changes happen. And so what ends up happening, Milwaukee becomes, in many ways, a poster child of this type of liberatory struggle. But we don't get credit for it, right? We think of Dr. King and all of the work that was done there. People don't realize Dr. King came to Milwaukee and gave speeches in Milwaukee on at least a couple of occasions that I'm familiar with. So he realized that Milwaukee was an important place. He realized that Milwaukee's leaders, Vale Phillips, Father James Groppe, the Lloyd Barbies of the world, the NAACP Youth Council, these young kids, were a powerful force. They were just as powerful as those kids in Birmingham who were loaded into cattle cars and arrested during the Birmingham campaign for Dr. King. Young people in Milwaukee did the exact same thing. They were right there fighting. They weren't afraid of anybody. They were going to stand up to this injustice and let their voices be heard, whether it be boycotting the schools that were not treating them well, or whether it be saying that, listen, we should be able to live wherever we want to live. We should be able to work wherever we want to work. Those voices of young people, I think, are incredibly important. And I think that's one of the things that shows how Milwaukee is a microcosm of the country, because you saw the same thing in city after city. But the way we teach history, Denise, it's unfortunate. We never give credit to young people, right? We never give credit to teenagers who risked their lives because their parents couldn't, because they were risking their jobs. Give credit to young people so that young people now can see that they have the power, they have the intelligence, they have the lack of fear that those young people had. We're seeing some of the same things with young people today, and we need to give them much more credit than we give them. I've always said this, when I was a teacher, I told my students, question everything. Don't just let somebody tell you something, believe it. Do your own research, re-educate yourself, and understand that you can be a voice of change. You can be the change agents in our society. You don't have to sit around waiting on the next Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Rosa Parks. You can be those people yourself.
Absolutely. I love this. This is so rejuvenating. And I love how you focus in on the power that our young and future leaders have. Any shout outs you want to give, Reggie, in terms of some extraordinary youth that are doing incredible civil rights action? Anyone you want to recognize?
Well, I want to organize some organizations, recognize some organizations that are really pushing young people, to do some of this work. Charlene Moore, her and her husband Reggie started the Urban Underground. It's a wonderful organization that's working with youth in our community, building leadership capacity in them, putting them in positions where they can voice their opinions. Andre Lee Ellis, We Got This. Yes, they just recently merged with the Running Rebels. These organizations are putting young people in a position where they can see that they have power. And there's so many others. I mean, I always say that we shine a negative light on so many things in Milwaukee, but there's so many things we should shine a positive light on. Regardless of what we think about young people, and we hear a lot of negative things about young people, for every young person that's doing something that, we don't like, there are 100 young people that are doing things that are positive in the city. We need to shine lights on these young people. We need to show that they have the capacity to build for the future, to make Milwaukee what they want it to be. They're just not just a bunch of, empty-headed, young, basically young adults. They're still children. So their minds are still growing, their brains are still developing. But during the process, Denise, what happens is they have a voice. They want to be heard. They want people to listen to them. They don't want older people to say, oh, you're too young, you don't have any experience, you don't know what you're talking about. They don't want to hear that. They've been hearing that for too long. They want people to say, oh, let me hear what you have to think about this, and to work with them. And I think those three organizations in particular are really facilitating that type of work. And there are multiple organizations in the Latino community that are doing the same thing, in the Hmong community that are doing the same thing. Just a lot of wonder. I mean, if I was to list off all of the people in Milwaukee I admire that are doing this work, we'd be on here for the next 17, 18 hours, Denise.
I love it. That's so good to know. I'm so glad that you shared that with us, because oftentimes the image of civil rights leaders, not just at a local Milwaukee level, but at a national level, tend to be the same faces. And we all know that it truly takes a village. And there are so many unsung heroes and sheroes, such as the next Belle Phillips, that exist and reside and do the work here in Milwaukee. So thank you for amplifying that awareness. And I encourage each of us as the elders or as the leaders to make room for these young folks, as you had mentioned, and really give them the platforms and support that they need, because we can't continue to rely on 3 or 4 people. We have to make sure that we are incorporating and just embracing all of the incredible civil rights activists and game changers here in Milwaukee. So thank you for bringing that to life.
Yeah, sure. I want to just share one more person that I think, well, now
Please.
this isn't a Milwaukee person. This is a young person that young people should investigate who this young woman was. We all know the story of Rosa Parks, right? Refusing to give up her seat on the bus. But we don't know the story of 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, who did the same exact thing before Rosa Parks did. And this brave young woman stood up to a law that had been in place. And, you know, she risked her life by doing this, but she's never really given credit in the way that we teach the civil rights movement. If we were to put the Claudette Colvins of the world forefront instead of Rosa Parks, listen, nothing against Rosa Parks. She's a wonderful woman, and what she did was phenomenal, all those other things. But Claudette Colvin, a young 15-year-old girl, did this before Rosa Parks. Let's acknowledge those young people. Let's acknowledge the power that they had, the fierceness that they had, the resiliency that they had. It wasn't just about the elders in the community. It wasn't just about the adults in the community.
I love it. This is so inspiring. What a great way to start our week off. Now, I know we've got about 15 minutes left. So again, I want to encourage our distinguished viewers and listeners, take advantage of this incredible mind of Reggie Jackson. He has, again, a breadth and wealth of knowledge, not just based on the history of Milwaukee's civil rights movement, but a tremendous breadth of knowledge regarding our next steps. Speaking of which, I know many of our viewers and listeners are very solution oriented. We've identified the problems, we've identified the struggle, and quite frankly, there are a lot of actions that you described that happened in the 50s and the 60s that are still relevant today. When you look at present times in Milwaukee regarding civil rights, you talked about fair housing, you talked about access to good education, good public education. What are other areas right now in Milwaukee that, one, we need to put at the forefront of our focus, and two, how do we as citizens, so people who may not necessarily have relationships with local legislators, what is the work that we need to do as citizens of Milwaukee to ensure that the Black community is experiencing justice, is experiencing fair and equity, in fair treatment and equity in this community?
Well, I think the first thing that we all should do is to re-educate ourselves, right? To understand how we got to where we are, and to look at Milwaukee as being, you know, a place that is the poster child as being the worst place in America for Black people to live. Look at all of the disparities that exist for Black people in Milwaukee as compared to other places. Listen, nationally, the Black home ownership rate is 44%. In Milwaukee, it's 27%. And there are very specific reasons behind that. When you look at the challenges that we have to understand that another big challenge we have is policing in Milwaukee. Listen, the same way we're protesting policing in Milwaukee and in Minneapolis and in Ferguson and in Baltimore and all these other cities, people were doing the same thing in the 1950s and 1960s. In fact, they were doing the same thing in the 1940s in Milwaukee. The Black community, the youth of Black Milwaukee in the 1940s were complaining about the Milwaukee Police Department basically racially profiling. Of course, that term wasn't used back then, it didn't exist, but basically racially profiling young Black teenagers at that time. Here we are, you know, decades later in the same issues. I always say this, is that we can talk about police reform, we can talk about defunding the police, all these different things, but ultimately what we need to do is reevaluate policing. We haven't taken a real look at how policing is done. We haven't sat down and talked to people who are former police officers, and I've done this, and asked them, well, what would be some things you would change about the way we do policing? Because ultimately, all of the rhetoric about police reform, and once again, we're passing this law and that law, and listen, you have to do a fundamental change in the way we police, because I've said that I don't want the police to be called police officers. I want them to be known as peace officers. I don't want the police to feel like they have to pull out their gun and shoot people because they're in fear or they're supposedly in fear for someone else in the vicinity. The police in this country kill over 1,000 people every year. And the only country that has more deaths at the hands of police than the United States is Brazil. And I mean, they kill like 5 or 6 times more people per year, but they just have a horrible system of policing there. But we do too. We don't challenge it. And you know why we don't challenge it, Denise? Because we've all grown up watching the cop shows on TV. Right? Whether it be the shows that I watched when I was a little boy, where the cops are always the good guys. And listen, a majority of cops are the good guys. We need the police. I would never say we don't need the police, but what we need is to understand that when police officers do things that are criminal acts, we should treat them the same way we treat other people who commit criminal acts. Don't withhold the names of a police officer who kills somebody. Why are you withholding their name? If I walked out of my front door and shot and killed somebody today, Denise, it would be all over the internet, all over the news tonight, right? But a police officer can do the same thing, and it's 3 months later before you find out the name of the officer. You're not transparent. And because you're not transparent, guess what happens? You build distrust in the community. The police are already distrusted by the Black community and the Latino community. And you're building even more distrust by withholding the names of officers, not charging officers who kill someone. You know, you have to understand that in order to understand how you fix these problems, people need to stop looking at it from their perspective only and turn that lens around and look at it from someone else's perspective. That is why I think so many white people in our community are beginning to wake up to an understanding, because guess what? They went out and marched, right, last year after George Floyd was killed, and they marched against police brutality. And what happened to them? Peaceful marchers were brutalized by the police all over the city of Milwaukee, out in our suburban communities. They were brutalized. They got a taste of what we've been talking about, what we've been experiencing. And so now they're beginning to see, man, the police aren't necessarily the way they're portrayed on TV. I call those cop shows, which I refuse to watch, propaganda. It's propaganda, because it tells you a version of policing that if you ask any police officer the accuracy of any of the cop shows on TV, every officer I've ever asked about, they said those shows are garbage. They are so unrealistic. They're nothing like what real policing is like. And because we see those shows, we believe that's how policing works. We think that, well, everything is working fine. Oh, there's a few bad apples. No, there's no such thing as bad apples. You don't have bad apples in policing. You have a fundamental flaw in terms of the way the police has always reacted to the Black community, going back to the first police departments, which came out of the slave patrols way back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So that mindset is still the same. And unless we make a fundamental shift in how we police, then we're going to continue to have more protests, and it's going to make more people upset and all these other things. But listen, when you're being treated unfairly, no one has a right to tell you that you shouldn't be able to express the fact that you're being treated unfairly. No one has a right to tell you that you can't fight for what's right for you just because it may inconvenience them. And far too many people in our community are talking about, oh, I'm inconvenienced by the people marching. I'm inconvenienced because they're closing off the freeway. Well, listen, how about being inconvenienced for the last 400 years? Get a taste of that. Get a taste of 400 years versus you may have to sit on the freeway for 2 hours. 400 years, people.
And I just took a note because that was another hashtag. No one has the right to tell you how to communicate that you've been treated unfairly, because I know a lot of times the association of our outcry has been labeled as complaining. So I'm glad that you shared that. We do have a question, Reggie, from Facebook.
Okay.
And it says, in terms of holding legislators accountable, what do you suggest for those officials that run or get elected with openly racist ideology? I'm thinking specifically of an avowed American Nazi party, remember, that ran for office in Illinois within the last 10 years, and others across the country who were elected. How can we leverage social justice against people who seem to have been elected because of their racist ideologies while they are in office?
Well, it is simple. Raise awareness of who these people are and what they stand for. Listen, people of that ilk, they're not shy about expressing how they really feel. Use their words as your way of telling people who these people are. Listen, it's very challenging for people to accept that we have people that still think that way in this country, right? People think that, we're in a so-called post-racial America. No, we're not. There's no such thing as a post-racial America. You still have people that feel the same way as those people that were beating people on the Edmund Pettus Bridge back in 1960s. You still have those people in our society, because if you go back in these, and I used to tell my students to do this, go back and look at those images of the civil rights movement in Milwaukee, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Birmingham, in Selma, wherever, and look at the image and look for the children, the white children. Look at the white children in those photographs and ask who they are, where they are now. Is that little white child who was standing there watching their father beat the crap out of a black person with a baseball bat? Where are they now? What was put into the mind of that white child? And do you think that somehow, just because you passed a law, that mindset that was put in that child as a very young person hasn't stayed the same? That person may be some of these people that you're voting for. It's maybe one of these people that are promoting these ideals. I think just raising people's awareness, like, listen, did you know that this person said X, Y, and Z? Did you know that this person did A, B, and C? Point them out. I disagree with people that say, call people in instead of calling them out. I don't agree with that. If you want to be called out, you say things that are outrageous, and I will call you out. I don't have any hesitation to call out someone for being a racist, because if you're not calling somebody who's a racist, then you may as well just go back and go to bed and just forget about the world around you, because ultimately somebody has to do it. Now, I've had family members that told me, Reggie, you have to be careful what you say. People may threaten your life and all these other. Listen, I don't care about all of that. I care about speaking truth to power. And if we don't have people that speak truth to power, then we're just going to continue to have a status quo. I don't want to live in a status quo. I want America to be better than America is. I want America to live up to what America should be. And as long as we support candidates like that, and a lot of people vote for people like that, call out those people that are voting for these people. Call out the people that are voting continuously for people that are doing things that are hurting white people, but they keep voting for them anyway. Mm-hmm. You're literally voting for people that are putting policies and practices in place that are not helping white people. They're there to damage Black people. They're not helping white people, but because you have racist views yourself, you're supporting those people. It's no different than when we passed, the Social Security Act in the 1930s, which restricted, Social Security to people outside of people who were domestic workers or farmers. Well, guess what? It was done to hurt Black people, who that was pretty much the only occupation you had in the South. But guess what? It hurt a whole lot of white people too, who were farmers. And so oftentimes white people don't understand that they're literally supporting people that are doing things that are hurting them just so they can win. It's not about winning all the time. It's not a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean that if Black people and Latino people and LGBTQ people, whomever, marginalized people, gain something, that the other people have to lose something. There's more than enough for everybody. There's an abundance of resources for everybody. There's no reason that we should have a homeless population in this country. There's no reason that we should have people who are struggling on a daily basis because we won't raise the minimum wage, and it hasn't been raised in over a decade. There's just no rational reason behind it.
Wow. Here's what's incredible about where we are right now, Reggie. We literally have 3 minutes, and I feel like we're just getting started, because you've shared so many incredible, as I call, nuggets. And I just want to recap before we close and get some final thoughts from you. Do the research. Do the research. And for many of us in this session, as we are viewing and listening to Mr. Jackson, we know we have an opportunity to re-educate ourselves. And part of that re-education, I want to just reiterate that organizations such as the Milwaukee Public Museum and the America's Black Holocaust Museum are providing us platforms where we can do just that, re-educate ourselves. Even when Reggie and I were talking offline, in preparing for this interview, he shared his experience upon visiting the Nelson Mandela exhibit, which, by the way, for those who do not know, this is the first time that this exhibit has existed anywhere in the country. Milwaukee is the first city in the United States of America to have and showcase this Nelson Mandela exhibit. Re-educating ourselves is starting with history, knowing where we came from, knowing the influencers, the fighters, the leaders. So I want to encourage everyone to take advantage of the exhibit at the Milwaukee Public Museum. Mr. Jackson, as we are closing, we literally have 60 seconds left. Can you give us one or two actions that you recommend that viewers and listeners take in order to continue to fight for social justice in our Black community?
Well, to me, I always advise people to re-educate yourselves. Learn about those ugly parts of American history that were left out of your history books. There's a great deal of pushback against so-called, revising history and all of these things. Listen, America is not perfect. America has flaws just like every other country. We have to realize that we have to just kind of read those things, ingest those things, and just maybe gulp and say, man, I can't believe how horrible things are. But that's a part of who America is. Understand that those things led us to where we are today. And when you understand those things, Denise, what you end up doing is you have different conversations. You have what I call productive conversations, because guess what? Now you know exactly what you're talking about. You're not basing off of some mythological America. You're basing off the real deal America. 100% truth is better than the stuff that we typically give ourselves, because America teaches history to make us patriots. A real patriot is a person who challenges their country to live up to what it's supposed to be, not just say that we are something, knowing that we aren't what we say we are.
Folks, go out, re-educate, relearn, and challenge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Reggie, thank you for sharing your incredible research and expertise. Again, if you're interested in learning more about Milwaukee's struggle for social justice, please visit your local library, as Reggie had mentioned. Learn, educate on these topics, or become members and support other organizations like Wisconsin's Black Historical Society, America's Black Holocaust Museum, and also be sure to visit the Milwaukee Public Museum's Mandela, the official exhibit, offered in partnership with the America's Black Holocaust Museum. We need to learn more about the revolutionary struggle in both South Africa and in this country, and especially in Milwaukee. Thank you so much again. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great week.